Be a living testimony from Holocaust survivor Eva Schloss, the stepsister of Anne Frank. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children by the Nazi regime and their collaborators. What the Nazis attempted was nothing less than the total physical annihilation of the Jewish people. With gratitude to God, they failed. This unprecedented atrocity has come to be known as the Holocaust. Tonight, we are gathered as one people, the people of Puerto Rico. From all religions, faiths, backgrounds, and political affiliations, to pay homage to a heroine, Eva, who has lived through the pains of hell here on earth, who has experienced the greatest human degradation one can possibly fathom, has experienced cruelty perpetrated by intelligent human beings who have corrupted their God-given abilities to scheme and to plot, how to kill and to torture other human beings with greater efficiency. However, Eva has not allowed the realities of her unbearably sad and bitter years of war life to frame her outlook of life and temper her compassion for humanity and civilization. On the contrary, she has taken her pain and suffering and ventured out to the world to teach tolerance and love for all of humanity. Eva has been blessed, her blessing of advancement in years as an opportunity to continue to visit one community after another, to share and inspire all of us to recognize, cherish, and value the infinite value of every single human life. Personally, I cannot help but personalize this evening here today. I will always remember my grandfather, who lived through the horrors of the Nazi invasion by running higher and deeper into Russian territory, himself drafted into the Russian army at some point. He lost most of his family, some of whom it was related were buried alive. My memories are of a man whose face exhibited a deep sadness and an impenetrable wall. The past was locked up in a vault, never to be heard from, never, like most people of his generation. But his sensitivity and kindness was absolute. Yet as my wife Rachel and I were driving together with Eva and her friend Elizabeth from the San Juan airport to the Condado neighborhood in San Juan, we experienced her tremendous nobility and dignity and her kindness. Eva took an interest in the way the local population lived, was concerned how the people of Puerto Rico coped following the devastation of Hurricane Maria, commenting at the sad presence of a few homeless people and taking the moment to appreciate a hopeful musician playing his saxophone on a San Juan street. Eva, all of us present here tonight in Puerto Rico are grateful to you. You have taken it upon yourself to gift our community a living testimony of the horrors of the Holocaust. Through sharing your life's experience and ensuring that there will be another generation that will know of the horrors that humanity is capable of perpetrating when left to their own vices and when the world chooses to look the other way. Eva, through you, our community, and all those that are ready to hear your voice and message will carry the responsibility and burden to be agents for the oppressed and downtrodden that have no voice because their mouths have either been sealed shut by dictators and tyrants, or at times it's simply because they have lost the ability to cry out loud enough for us to hear. And we must be their voices. We also acknowledge the presence, and pray for the continued well-being of our friend, Mr. Jack Desperak, a Holocaust survivor of Auschwitz and a local resident of Puerto Rico for over 60 years. This is a unique event for the community of Puerto Rico. Over 1,200 gathered here tonight to hear the message and affirm our fidelity with the divine mandate. Do not stand idly by while your brother's blood is being shed, because I'm the Lord. In biblical law, there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. We are morally bound to respond to the cry of the oppressed. Where great opportunities are present, quite often, there are also present great challenges. We faced our fair share of challenges to arrive at this moment. And there is one very special person who would not take no, or we cannot, as an option. Mrs. Soila Levis, thank you for willing this event into reality. No matter the time of day, you were available and ready to do whatever is necessary. Thank you. This is also very personal for Soila and her family, whose family traced their roots to Janov, Poland, and their four grandparents, Joseph and Chaya, Lou Levis, and Leva and Zlata Goldstein, who were murdered in the forests of Poland. May their memories be remembered. We acknowledge the presence of Honorary Consul from Israel to Puerto Rico, David Efron, from the Senate of Puerto Rico, Senator Henry Newman, President of the San Juan Municipal Assembly, Marco Riga, Regional Director for Jewish Federation of North America, Mr. Ed Finkel, from the Jewish Community Center of Puerto Rico, Religious Director Diego Mendelbaum, and co-presidents Mark Perez-Divin and Eric Charak. Temple Beth Shalom, Rabbi Norman Pates and President Dr. Emily Krasinski. Chabad Jewish Center of Puerto Rico, Chairman of the Board, Mr. Henry Orlinsky. I acknowledge with gratitude my friends and colleagues, Diego from JCC Puerto Rico, who has shouldered the burden together and embraced tonight's initiative from the get-go. And we have walked step by step all the way to this moment. And Rabbi Norman Pates from Temple Bet Shalom, for your encouraging words and your youthful eagerness was a great inspiration in forging ahead. And to my dear wife, Rachel, who is a selfless partner in every sense of the word, whose support and vision was instrumental in making this evening a reality. We thank some of our sponsors, Maria Luisa and Luis Alberto Ferre, together with their grand El Nuevo Dia family for their amazing support. Mirna Perez and Apple Cruz from Museo de Arte Puerto Rico, with Senor Jepet Perez and the staff at Bellas Artes, for helping us pull off this special evening with the challenge of a change of venue in Puerto Rico. Jose from Fangig and Eliezer from El Radical and Alberto Grau from Ticket Center, who have all collaborated jointly to allow this evening to be a reality. Thank you. JFNA, Jewish Federation of North America, Nestor from Acantos, and Emir Feliciano from Puerto Rico DJ for the audiovisual and music sponsorship. Thank you. And finally, we welcome and thank Cristina Fernandez, Deputy Director, Lifestyles, Entertainment and Culture at El Nuevo Dia, who will be leading the conversation with Eva. And without further ado, we welcome Eva with Cristina Fernandez.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see such a big crowd. It's a pleasure to be here, and so many young people and older people, and really a wonderful audience. And I hope you're going to learn quite a bit of this terrible, terrible time, because we are now getting thin on the ground. You know, I was 15 when I was in Auschwitz, and most people, of course, who did survive were older, between 20 and 40. So unfortunately, we have lost many, many of those survivors.
Of those survivors and people who have gone through traumatic experiences, many choose to remain silent. You decided to remain silent for almost 40 years. What happened? When did you decide to open up and speak up?
Well, when I came back from Auschwitz, I was just 15 years old, and I really wanted to tell people what had been happening, what we have suffered. I wanted people to feel sorry for me and help me to get over this terrible period. But, you know, in Europe at the time, in 45, there was unbelievable chaos. Everybody had suffered, everybody had lost family, and people said, well, we know it was terrible, but let's move on. So people didn't want to hear our stories. That came only much, much later. With me, it was actually 40 years, and it was just a coincidence, because, you know, in Amsterdam, the Anne Frank, where the family were hiding, the Anne Frank house became a museum, and the people there decided not everybody can come to Amsterdam and hear the story, so that it made a traveling exhibition. And the very first one was in English, and it came to London. And of course, my mother and me were invited. Otto Frank, who became my stepfather and the second husband of my mother, had died already. And so I went there with my mother, and some of my daughters were there. But I expected I will just be in the audience, and here there was a platform where people were speaking about the event. And the organizer said to me, come and sit with us at the table on top. And very innocently I went and sat there. And after everybody had spoken very movingly, he said, and now Eva will want to say something to you. I was a very, very shy person at the time still. I'd never spoken about my experience, and certainly not as many people as here, perhaps 200 people. And, but you know, I got up and I had no idea what I was going to say. And so everybody looked up at me, up and expecting. And so eventually everything which I had suppressed for 40 years came flooding out. So it was for me really a very, very important moment.
Let's go back to 1930s. You were a little girl in Vienna, in Austria, and you lived a very happy life at that moment. Can you tell us?
Yes, we had a big extended family. We were Jewish, of course, but not particularly religious. And we had grandparents, and an older brother, and Austria is a beautiful country, mountains and lakes, and I was very sporty. I went with my father mountain climbing and skiing in the winter, and it was just lovely. But Hitler marched in unexpected, uninvited, in March 1938, and the Austrians, our friends, suddenly became completely anti-Semitic. They stood in the streets with Heil Hitler salute, with swastika flags waving. Where they got them suddenly, nobody knew. And we were suddenly the enemy. In Austria and Germany, you had to have religious education in school. So the Jewish children were called out, and we had the Old Testament, and we learned a bit of Hebrew, and the Christian children stayed in the class, and so everybody knew who was a Jew. And my brother, he was 12 years old at the time. He came home the first day after the occupation, and he looked terrible. He was all beaten up. And when my parents questioned him, what on earth has happened? He said, my own friends did that, and the teacher just watched and let it happen.
And your family decided to move to Belgium first?
Well, we didn't decide. We tried to get out anywhere, but and this is really was the trouble, and this is again something which reminds me of now, that many refugees, people who wanted to leave, had to leave because they knew there was no future in Germany or Austria for Jewish people, but the world had closed their gates. And so my father had business contact in Amsterdam, in Holland, so he left actually, I think 2-3 days after occupation. And when we wanted to follow, Holland too had closed their gates. And so we went illegally to Belgium, where you could go, and once you were there, you could stay. So we were separated. Was not very good. And what was of course terrible, you couldn't take anything with you. So just a little suitcase with a few bits of clothes. So we had to leave everything behind, no money you could take. So of course, you know, people were very poor. And it was a culture shock for me suddenly. And in Belgium, the refugees was something one didn't know at the time. So there was this little girl who didn't speak the language. I was put in the back of the class, and I had just tried to follow. Really very bad.
And after Belgium, as a family of refugees, you went to Amsterdam.
My father tried for many months to get a visa for us to come to Holland, and eventually in February 1940 was already the war. We got a visa to come for 3 months to visit my father in Holland.
You were about to turn 9 years old when you were living with your mother.
Yeah.
And the lady who you were living with allowed to have a birthday party for celebrating your 9th birthday.
Yeah.
She even made a cake. And you were identified, you mentioned it in your book, as the Jew little girl who has worked a lot with the language, right?
Right, yeah.
You invited some friends?
A few little girls, because in Vienna I had lovely birthday parties, and so I gave a little invitation to 5, 6 girls, and the day of my birthday they all brought a letter from their parents that they are not allowed to come to my party. I went home crying. I said to my mother, I don't understand, we didn't have a quarrel. And my mother said, well, we are Jewish refugees and people just don't want to mix with us. So, you know, for a little girl to get this experience, that is something which stays with you.
Was that the first time you became conscious of what
Well,
was
in
going on?
Austria, of course, as well. And, you know, as children, we didn't quite understand what is wrong with Jews, why should we be different, and why should people hate us. It was a big problem to suddenly experience.
Now in Amsterdam, you mentioned you had a relatively normal life. I mean, in the
the Dutch,
conditions.
yeah, this was wonderful. The Dutch people were very welcoming. They always had taken in refugees, and so we thought, well, it's going to be good here again.
And being there, you met a girl about your same age. Her name was Anne.
Anne Frank, that's right. We were both 11 years old when we met. We lived on a big open square where little apartments, but there were no yards for, excuse me,
Yes,
for children to play. And so all the children came out to play in the street. And so one day a little girl said, her name was Anne Frank, she comes from Germany as well, and you are new here, and she took me up to her apartment to meet her family. This was the first time that I met Otto Frank. And we became friends, but she was quite sure of herself. She was a big chatterbox and as well interested in boys already. And when I told her I had an older brother, she said, when can I come and visit you in your apartment?
And we'll get back to Anne Frank and your memories with her in a second. But in America, and particularly in Puerto Rico, turning 15 years old, quinceañera, we call it a big celebration for the girls.
Right.
And that same day where you were celebrating your 15th birthday, you were captured. Can you tell us about that moment?
Yeah. Well, the Germans, you probably know, captured practically the whole of Europe. And Holland was occupied, Belgium, France, Sweden, Denmark, the Balkans, was all under Nazi rule. And in all those countries, Jewish people started to be deported. In 1942, so 2 years occupation, they sent letters out to about 10,000 young people, including my brother, who was 16, and Anne's older sister, Margot, 16 as well, to come and work in Germany, in German factories. Well, our parents were suspicious. First they killed Jews in Germany and in many countries, and then they invite them back. So my father called us together and said, Heinz, you are not going, we are going into hiding. And I said, what do you mean hiding? Couldn't understand that adults, families going hiding. And he explained, we are going to stay with good people who risk their life to keep us. But I didn't find a family who would take in 4 people. So we have to split up. I will go with mother and Heinz will go with him. And I didn't want to be separated, and I started to cry. And my father explained, if we are in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. So survive. So that was really the first time that I realized it is a matter of life and death. And that was scary.
So at the time, your father and your brother were apart, and you were with your mom because you
Yeah.
had to divide. And you remember
But-
that?
Yeah, but nevertheless, on my 15th birthday, so after 2 years in hiding, we were all four betrayed. It's a complicated story. We won't have time to go into this, but by a Dutch nurse who was a double agent. She pretended she works for the resistance, but she really worked for the Nazis.
You were sent with your family to a prison in Amsterdam. Spent a few
One night to a prison, like criminals.
And then shortly after that, a train to Westerbork,
Yeah.
a regular passenger train.
Westerbork was a holding camp. You know, all the people who were arrested and caught or taken from their own homes, of course, you want to have them central somewhere. So there were the holding camps. The people were going put there, and then when the train was ready, they went.
And
It was all very, very organized, amazingly organized. And the Germans had to fight a war. In 1944, they had lost already in Africa. The Russians were already advancing. And nevertheless, they spent a lot of energy and manpower to transport Jewish people to their deaths. It's really amazing.
in that same organized system, you were boarded a train, a cargo train to Auschwitz. Do you
Yeah.
remember that trip?
Oh yes, it was we call it cattle train or a goods train. It looked a bit like a container. There was, of course, no windows, nothing in it, and just floorboards. And they pushed in about 80 people. There were 2 buckets, one to use for toilets, open bucket, and the other one for clean water for 80 people. Of course, never enough. But it was the last time that we were together as a family. So my father, with tears in his eyes, apologized to us that from now on he can't look after us anymore. If you are dead, you have children, and you can't look after your family, how sad is that? And he found this really, he said, I got you out of Austria, kept you safe for 2 years in hiding, but from now on, you'll be on your own.
So the train arrived, and what was it coming out? What did you confront it?
Well, it was 5-6 days of terrible journey, and then the train stopped, and it turned out to be Auschwitz. And we knew what Auschwitz was, because the BBC then broadcast out in their own language to all the occupied countries, and always told about the progress of the war, but also about the 300 death camps, and there were some work camps as well in Germany and Poland. And Auschwitz was always mentioned as the biggest, where Jewish people were systematically being gassed. So you can imagine what we felt when we were there. The next command was, so raus, raus, so you jump down, and then men and women to different sides. If somebody of you has been in Auschwitz, you might have remembered it's in a huge, huge area. I think probably bigger than your capital city, and with different camps. Auschwitz was a men's camp, which the name is very well known, and the women's camp was Birkenau. So we had to separate. You can imagine the separation. Mothers and sons and husbands and wives and fathers and daughters, assuming perhaps they will never ever see each other again on earth.
You arrived to Auschwitz in 1944, right? About almost 75 years ago. We have a lot of children and young people in our audience that doesn't necessarily relate to what happened, otherwise that they've read in the books and see movies. You witnessed extreme cruelty. Can you tell us some examples of what was the day in the camp?
Well, we lost already in the beginning half our transport because a selection was taking place. Meaning Dr. Mengele, a proper medical man, looked you over just for a fraction of a second and decided this side or this side, life or death. All children, there were no children in Auschwitz. Older people, depending how you looked, you could have been 40, you had a bad journey, you were white and sickly looking, went to the wrong side. My mother, there was a lady next to my mother with a baby, and then Mengele said to an older woman who was walking next to this young mother, she said, give your child to this old lady, and you go this way, and the others went that way. The separated families, it was just unbelievable cruel. And then the people who were selected to go into the camp, we were herded like cattle, you know, not like human beings. In a big, big barrack, the next command, undressed completely naked. And the Nazis were walking around and poking fun at you. Then all our hair was shaved, and then we were tattooed. A number on your arm, and we were told, forget you have a name, from now on you're just a number. If ever we want you, you'll be just called out as a number. And while this was going on, this is what I object the most, the extreme cruelty. So can you imagine a mother who was there but had been separated from her toddler? They told the people who went the other way, they were told they were going to have a shower, and then they laughed, but it wasn't a shower, but gas came out. And within 15 minutes, everybody had fallen to the ground and was dead. Can you imagine if a mother had just been separated from her child? So people started to cry and to scream. Terrible, terrible atmosphere. And then we were told, and now you go to a shower. Of course, we didn't want to go, but we were pushed in, and it did turn out to be a shower. Then, still naked, we were herded out, and there were huge heaps. The first one was clothes, not proper clothes, and you were shown one garment, could have been a winter coat or a night dress. The next heap were shoes. You got 2 shoes, again, never a pair, and that was all the belonging you ever had. And again, then you were herded like cattle, you know, quick, 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 run, into our barracks, which were in Birkenau, 3 high, about 2 yards wide, and 8 people had to sleep on there. Just a board, no blanket, no pillow, nothing.
Your mother, Fritzi, Mutti for you, was called for death at a moment, and how did you find out?
My mother, it became already October perhaps. You know, we didn't know what time of the year it was. We only judged by the seasons. About once a week you had a shower, you were deloused, because we were full of lice, not just head lice, but body lice, full of scratches, and became wounds with dirty fingernail. Washing, forget about washing. Only once a week, a shower, cold water in winter. And we got out of the shower, and there stood Mengele with some of his SS men, and a selection had taken place. Meaning, he looked you over, you had to turn around in front of him, and then he decided this side again or that side, life or death. And 40 of our Dutch transport, including my mother, was selected to be killed. I just wanted to run over still to her to say goodbye, but I was beaten with a big stick over my back and separated. So not even goodbye, you could say. And those women walked out naked, and I thought I'd lost my mother. That was, of course, for me the darkest day, darkest moment in my whole life.
What kept you strong? Where did energy to survive came from under those conditions?
Well, I was 15 years old. I had experienced a wonderful life, and I really wanted to have this as well. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have children. I wanted to have grandchildren. So I never ever gave up. I just didn't give up. And that is because Primo Levi is another survivor, an Italian. He wrote many, many books, wonderful books as well. And he says he knew when somebody was going to die, when they'd given up hope. So only through hoping did you have a chance to make it.
Going back to the incident where your mother was selected, there at the camp you discovered Minnie, who was a nurse, who was your mother's cousin, and she helped you. You mentioned her and her encounter as a miracle, and you also mentioned that surviving was a miracle.
Well, if you speak to any Holocaust survivor, he will tell you there was a lot of luck involved. That you were just at the right place at the moment, that you met somebody or so on. Well, we were very, very lucky. A cousin of my mother who had been deported from Prague worked with this Dr. Mengele, and she had quite a bit of influence. And in the night that when my mother was selected, I'd still run to where she was sleeping and told her what has happened. And then we were moved to a bit different place, and I didn't know what had happened. But my mother was saved, but I didn't know that.
While in the camp, once you had the opportunity to see your father, you went to the men's camp, and how was that moment to finally see him after?
Well, I didn't know, of course, if my father had been selected or if he was still alive. And once I was working, we were working all the time from morning till late at night. And but this was a better work. And I was sitting down against the wall, and I saw a man across the fence, barbed wire, electrified barbed wire fences, and in a striped uniform and a striped beret, and he looked slightly familiar. And when I looked closer, I realized it was my father. Again, an amazing coincidence. And he told me that he was still okay, that my brother was okay, which, helped me, of course. But after my mother was selected, and it was winter, and it was very, very cold. I had frostbite on my feet, and I was on the point of giving up. I said, I can't just carry on anymore. And I was working, and I was called out, and I was scared. Well, what do they want of me now? And I went outside, and there stood my father. A miracle. Never a man came to the women's part of the camp, and how he found me, I have till this day no idea. And of course, he asked where was Mutti, my mom, and I had to tell him that she was selected. And my father, in front of my eyes, collapsed and burst into tears. And, very often people ask, are you sorry that you have survived? Have you got survivor's guilt? I said, no, I'm very happy that I survived. But the only thing what I have a very bad guilt feeling was that I told my father that my mother had been selected. But, he asked, and I didn't know any different. So, and I think he gave up eventually.
And you finally got reunited with your mother while you were in the camp?
Yeah, we were reunited again. And again, which was a matter of great, great luck, the Russians were approaching and the Nazis evacuated the camp, took every day, emptied lots of barracks, and they marched into Germany or Austria. And after the war, those were called the death marches, because you can imagine weak in the winter. It was one of the coldest winter on record, to march without food. Very, very few people survived that. And I assume my brother died first. My father didn't think I could have survived. He thought his wife was dead. I think he gave up. And well, yeah, this is really a bit later to tell you. Well, eventually the Russians came to liberate the camp, and the war was still going on. That was January. I don't know if you know Holocaust Memorial Day. That is 27th of January. That's the day when Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians. And that is still a big memorial day, because there were not that many people left there, but it was still a change in the Germans were really losing the war.
In that process of liberation and everything you got through, you were looking for your father and you found a familiar face that you barely recognized?
Yeah.
Who it
Well,
was?
once when those Germans were gone and we were left on our own, and so I decided I would go to the men's camp, Auschwitz. And there as well, the Germans had taken most of the people away, and but there were perhaps 500-600 people left there. And I walked around everywhere trying to find my father and brother, but I saw two men who I'd known in Amsterdam. And I went to one and I looked him in the face, but he was all very thin and ashen colored. And I said, I think you look familiar. He said, yes, I'm Otto Frank, Anne's father. And you are Eva Geiringer, Anne's friend? I said, yeah, yes. So he asked me, have you seen my children or my wife? But I hadn't seen them. And he had seen my father and brother, but he said they've gone with the Germans. So at that time, I didn't know, of course, of death marches, so I had great hope that the war will soon be finished and we would be together again as a family.
So after being liberated and that extreme long trip through Russia and
Yeah,
the Dead Sea,
well, we had to wait, of course, till the end of the war. We were in the east and we couldn't go to the west, so the Russians took us eastward, and we traveled from January till May with the Russian eastward till we ended up in Odessa, which is now the Ukraine. If you've got my book, look it up on the map, what an enormous journey we did. And, and there we waited for the end of the war. And when that came, of course, we realized we had survived. And then was a long journey back through the Mediterranean, through France to Marseille, and then up to Holland. And eventually in July, we got back to Amsterdam. And there was chaos because the Germans had occupied that country and taken everything the Dutch produced to feed their own people, which is understandable perhaps. But it was called in Holland the hunger winter because 10,000 of people perished in their own apartments. They found bodies lying in their apartment. There were no cats and dogs, they had all been eaten. And then more people came, more refugees through Germany or through France, and they had to kind of try to look after us, but it didn't happen, of course. So it was again quite chaotic. And Otto Frank was as well with us on this journey, and he came to visit us. And we put adverts in the paper from my father and brother, Otto too. He went around to people trying to find if somebody had seen his girls or his wife somewhere. And so it was a very, very sad and chaotic period still. And eventually we got a letter from the Red Cross saying, very, very cold, not with sorry or anything, said your husband and your son perished in Mauthausen, which was a horrific Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. Well, that was for me the last straw. I had survived because I hoped we would be a family again. But when I realized that can never ever happen, I became very, very depressed.
How was trying to get to civilization and get back to normal life after?
I had to go back to school. I turned 16, and I felt I was an adult. I didn't really want to sit on a school bench again. But it was Otto Frank who told my mother, I have to go back to school because a good education is something nobody can take away from her. So I went back to school but didn't make friends. I was still too sad about the loss of my father and brother. So it was not a very nice school period for me either. And once I finished school, Otto had become sort of a house friend. He came to my mother, and he got, of course, a terrible sad news as well, that his wife and both his girls had died. And then Miep Gies, one of the helpers in the Secret Alex, I think many of you have read the diary. You want to put up your hand if you read the diary? Well, quite a few. And I think now in school here you do read it as well. So he got from Miep, one of the helpers, who found it when the family was arrested, and he published it, and the success story. Mm-hmm. And but of course, he very often said, I have nothing but the clothes on my body. I have no family, and his flat had disappeared. Everything had been shipped to Germany. He was really a very sad man. But I was very depressed, and I hated everybody. And he came to our house and said, I don't hate anybody, not even the Germans. And that was for me incomprehensible. I said, but they killed your whole family. And he said, yeah, but not every German is bad. And this was a bad period in history. He loved the German culture. He was in the First World War an officer for Germany. And he loved the music, the language. And he said, I'm a German and I can't just hate myself. And but I couldn't understand that at the time. I was really full of hatred and very, very, very miserable.
Otto married your mother in 1953, right? Did he talk often about Anne?
Oh, continuously. But I just want to tell a little story.
Yes, of course.
When I finished school, I didn't really know what to do with my life. And Otto and my mother, who had become a good house friend, decided I should become a photographer. And I didn't really care. And Otto knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio. And he had taken many, many, many pictures of his two girls with a good camera, a Leica. And he said, well, I have no family anymore. I'm not going to take any more pictures. I give you this camera, and I hope you become a very good photographer. So, and he knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio. And I went to London for a year as an apprentice to learn photography. And I lived in a little boarding house where there were some other young people. And there was a young man who'd come from Israel to study economics, and we both didn't have any money, and we went for long walks, and and we liked each other. And one day he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you. Will you marry me? And we can start a new life in Israel. And I said, no, thank you. Because, you know, I was a year in London, but I was going to go back to my mother. I was very close to my mother, as you can imagine. And I just couldn't imagine I would go off with a young man. So, and Otto came over, he kept a bit an eye on me, and I told him, this young man has asked him to marry him, but I said no, because I'm going back when my year's finished here. And he got a bit shy and said, you know, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and once you get settled, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man and said, you can marry me now. Which we did, but you know, we didn't really know each other. We took both a big gamble. We really wanted to start a life of our own. We wanted to start a family, and you know, and we didn't talk. I didn't tell him. I said I was Dutch, which I wasn't, because I was still stateless. He said he was Israeli, which he wasn't. He was a German refugee, and you know, we didn't know each other, but we were married for 62 years.
Wow.
So it obviously was a good choice. So you never, you know, you never know what you get. Yeah, and we have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren, and they're all real proper British, because we stayed in England. I never did go to Israel with my husband. But he of course stayed in England too.
Did you ever talk to your children about what you went through, or anybody close to your family?
That was something, you know, you just didn't talk about it. And Otto talked, of course, continuously. You asked this question before, continuously about Anne. And when the children did something wrong, he said, Anne would have done it this way and so on. But he never told them really who this Anne was, you know. So it was always sort of a mystery. And it did burden my children that this Anne, who they don't know, had done everything better than what they are doing. So, but it took them a long time to realize then eventually who Anne was, when, and you know, that it was Otto. He had, after all, two daughters, and he never, hardly ever spoke about Margot. And he very often said, I really feel quite guilty. I had, after all, 2 daughters, but Anne is on my mind. He was really obsessed with her, not so much even about her character, but about her message, which is in the diary, of course.
Do you remember the first time you had access to the diary?
Well, it was published in Dutch first, and after it was published, of course, he gave to all Anne's friends and a lot of many other people, he gave the diary. And I looked at that time, you know, I was still full of hatred and very miserable, and I leafed through it, and I said, well, so what? I went through the same thing. I was not impressed. Only when I read it many years later did I realize how wise she was. She was between 13 and 15. She wrote all those amazing things about feminism, about the world, about hatred, about God. Yeah, you know, which I, at that time, when I was 13, 14, I didn't think about things like that at all. My mother always said I'm a late developer, which I think I did, because I wrote now, in the last 15 years, I wrote 3 books, And I talk freely in many, many countries to educate people about the danger of prejudice.
You became a spokesperson of love, of compassion, of saying no to racism. How does a person make a transition from something so negative to a positive and to a spread?
Well, I think if you have seen so many lives lost, especially children, so the birth of my first daughter was for me a miracle. And you know, I love nature. I wanted to become a tulip grower, even so sort of, not seriously, but I loved nature. I loved anybody of you ever go to Holland, go in May when all the tulips are out. It's just a magnificent spectacle. And, you know, I wanted to go back to nature. And, yeah, I mean, I did photography, but it wasn't my favorite. That was
Were you a good photographer?
That was something chosen by Otto and my mother, you know. And I did it for quite a few years, but then I gave it up.
If you would have the opportunity to talk to world leaders or prime ministers or, let's say, President Donald Trump, what would you say? What would you tell to them?
Well, I have a good advice for President Trump. You know, he wants to make America great again. And the only way to do it, if you get a good educated people, and not just the wealthy white people, but even the poor black people. Everybody has talents, and if you use them, you can get a good country. But unfortunately, education is very different. Poor people in England as well. I speak a lot in English schools, the private schools where people pay, I think you call it public schools. The children have amazing opportunities, and then in the inner city where many black people live, they haven't even got textbooks, the bad teachers, they come out and don't really know much. And that is a big mistake. You know, I think about the Jewish people who came to countries as refugees. They had no money, they started to be peddlers, but the most important thing was for the children to get the best education possible. And that is why, you know, when I speak in Muslim schools very often in England, I ask them, do you know how many Muslims are in the world, and you know how many Jewish people are in the world? They say, yeah, Muslim perhaps 400 million, and Jews perhaps a little bit less, 300 million. I said, no, 16 million. 16 million in the whole world. And look what we have achieved. In science, we have had many people who got Nobel Prizes in science, in literature, in engineering, in philosophy, in medicine, only through a good education.
I have some questions from the audience that we gathered earlier this evening, and so I'm going to read them for you.
All right.
Did you have resentment to the world at large, or to the Dutch in particularly, who directly affected your imprisonment?
Well, that's a very good question, because the Dutch have a good name through Anne Frank, I suppose, but there were in Holland as well a lot of Nazis who betrayed Jewish people. And that was just not just the Dutch, but that was in all the occupied countries. So yes, the Dutch were not that good, but on the other hand, there were a lot of people who helped Jewish people going into hiding, who did survive, like us, for my mother and me. Yeah, so the question was, if you have to against the Dutch resentment. No, because you know, everywhere you have good people and bad people.
Why do you use the term prisoners for those held in the concentration camps? Is it like giving credibility to the criminal enterprise? They are more like people being held hostage.
I didn't quite get this.
Why do you use the term prisoners?
Prisoners.
Instead of hostage, for example, I guess the person was trying to.
Well, they were not actually called prisoners, they were inmates. Because prison is something different. That is when you're in an enclosed area. I mean, this was enclosed, but it was big. And you went out, you went to work. So, no, you didn't really say prisoners.
This is a statement and then a question. When you mention you find some sugar in the floor, you were craving for a sweet, it makes me think of all the blessings we have and how underappreciated it is. What can you tell young people about how underappreciating the good things of life?
Yeah, well, this is worldwide now, that young people are very impatient. They want to have, if they fancy something, they want to have it now and then. They're actually quite spoiled. And, you know, when we got for our birthday, we got a fountain pen or what else did we get? A book. Or I got once when there was already little food, I got 3 bananas from somebody, and I didn't like bananas. But, you know, and you were actually happy with little things. And now the young people want really immediately everything. And you have to appreciate, you have to work for something, you have to earn it before you really should have it. And this would be a much better way. You feel happier if you have achieved something because through your own work you can afford something. And as well, you know, you read so much that young people have depressions. And why? Because somebody is bullying you on internet. Those are, you know, little things. Look at the big picture. See that what you have got, you're lucky, you have your family, you get food every day. Appreciate what you have got and think of the poor people who haven't and share with the world what you don't really need.
That's another question. Do you believe that the average everyday citizen could have done more? You referenced being taken out of work while in the camp. And you say the farmers in the field looked away as most people when confronted by things they don't want to know about.
Of course, all this wouldn't have happened, first of all, if all the countries in the world would have taken in refugees, and they could have coped with it. And the other thing was that...
that if you think the average everyday citizen could have done more for helping?
Well, first of all, you know, not everybody in Germany agreed with what Hitler was going to do with the Jewish people. But, and you call this bystanders. They didn't really care enough to object. There was some resistance, of course, which isn't very well known, but which is a shame because there was some, but not enough. Because Hitler, of course, if you were objecting, you were as well put in concentration camps. But if half the population would have objected, he couldn't have put them in concentration camps. So yes, it could have all been avoided.
While you were in prison in Amsterdam, and then the train trip, and in the barracks, you met Francie, a lady who was about to go to college at the time she was captured. She became very important support for your mom and for you. What happened to her?
She did survive, and she went later to Israel, and we were friends with her for as long as she lived.
So you kept in communication
we
after.
kept in touch.
And the nurse, your friend's cousin, also.
Oh, of course, yes, of course. Well, she was a relative anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In your book, After Auschwitz, you say that in about 30 years, there will not be any Holocaust survivors alive.
That's true. Even less than 30 years.
What would be the message you, Eva, would like to transmit to new generations or even babies that haven't been born and will get to know this story?
Well, when I came back from Auschwitz, people say, never again Auschwitz, we have learned our lesson, but we haven't. Perhaps yes, in the 50s and 60s, we still did learn from it. But then later started again the wars, Korean War, the Vietnamese War, in Libya and now Syria and Afghanistan, and people are killed continuously for no reason actually whatsoever. So, you know, peace is the best thing in the world. And, you know, the Jewish religion, Moses gave the world the 10 Commandments. 10 very simple rules. If everybody would live with keeping those 10 Commandments, law for you how to act, we would have the most beautiful, peaceful, wonderful world. And that is what we have to aim for, to give everybody a right to live in I wouldn't say in luxury, but to have enough. Then all the rich European countries and America have thousands of homeless people sleeping in the streets. All this is not necessary. We have been given a wonderful earth with big riches, and we can share this out evenly. This is what we have to aim for, and much more even society.
What would you like the audience to remember about Eva, about your life? What would you like the audience to remember?
Well, that even if you have, and I think, you know, everybody, if not, you would be extremely lucky. Everybody goes through some bad patches in your life. You lose people, you lose your job, you have an accident, health problem, but it's not only bad news. There's a lot of good things in the world, and look at the good things, and try to be happy and make your friends and your parents and everybody around you happy as well. Then the world would be a beautiful place for everybody.
I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. You've been a wonderful interviewer. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks to the audience.
Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well done. I managed.
We'll take a moment. We're actually going to stand in just a moment and pause for reflection, for a moment of silence. And each one, as Eva had suggested, can take the moment to reflect and give thanks and recognition for the blessings that have been gifted to us, the blessing of life and health and happiness, security, the countries we live in. So for now, we'll take a 60-second pause for a moment of silence and pay homage to all those that have risked and lost their lives. And it's not in vain, because we're here to stand in for them and make a difference. Thank you. And on that note, we will wish everyone a pleasant evening. And once again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.